Hi, I'm Andy Pavord, and I'm here to talk about the federal budget. And today we're going to talk about the House and Senate budget resolutions as of today, February 13th, 2025. Now, this week, the budget process got kind of serious because both the House and the Senate released their drafts of the budget resolution. Now, these resolutions are still incomplete. We've got a long, long way to go, but we can still glean some important insights into what is going on in the budget process right now. So that's what we're going to focus on today. So I want to start, though, take a minute because some of you may be unfamiliar with the budget reconciliation process and the budget resolution process, to give you a quick overview. So this chart shows the congressional budget process from established by the 1974 Budget Act as amended a couple of times since then. So let's look at this process. In February, the president submits to Congress the president's budget. That details all the spending that the president proposes and policy decisions, and it's a big, massive document with thousands of pages. In March, the CBO reviews the budget and publishes an analysis. And the budget committees are supposed to take this budget into consideration, but they build their own budgets, in essence, through something called a budget resolution. Now, they report their budget resolutions, which broadly establish how much money is going to be spent, what the deficit is going to be, and then they allocate that funding to committees, appropriations committees, and they also do something called reconciliation instructions. So in May, the House and Senate must pass, or at least according to schedule, would pass the concurrent budget resolution. Now, note this is not a law. It is not signed by the president. It's a resolution that establishes rules under which the House and Senate will consider appropriation laws and other legislation. And there's two major pieces to a budget resolution. There's the committee allocations process, where each appropriation committee is given a sum of money or a target for budget authority. And then the subcommittees are also given budget authority later on by the appropriation committee chairs and appropriation committees. And then there's an appropriation process that goes on through the summer where appropriation committees have hearings and then they pass bills that are reported to the floor. And eventually the goal is that the appropriation bills would pass the House and the Senate by September, and the president would sign the appropriation bills into law. But there's also a concurrent process that happens during the appropriation process, and this is reconciliation. So in the budget resolution, the Congress, the House and Senate may put in reconciliation instructions. They don't have to, but they may do this. Now, the purpose of reconciliation instructions is to direct authorizing committees to change their laws so that they are in conformity with the budget that is included in the budget resolution. So the reconciliations go to the committees, and then the committees submit their bills back to the budget committees. And then the budget committees report the reconciliation bills to the House and Senate floor. And in the Senate, this becomes very important because it's considered a privileged piece of legislation. So the filibuster doesn't apply. And that's why over the last 20 years or so, major pieces of legislation like Obamacare and the Inflation Reduction Act and the American Rescue Plan COVID legislation have all been done through the reconciliation process because it's a way for the Senate to avoid filibusters. So then the House and Senate pass a reconciliation bill and the president will sign a reconciliation bill. So what we're going to do next is take a look at the House and Senate versions of the reconciliation bill that have been made public this week. We're going to focus, now here's the table of contents, and as you'll see in a minute, the recommended levels and amounts have not been added, so we can't really talk about them yet. But they have added information about reconciliation instructions. So we're going to take a look at that. And that's what we're going to focus on for the next few minutes. Now, the drafts, as I said, released by House and Senate, they don't include recommended funding levels, deficit levels, revenue targets, or anything like that. It just has them as blank. So let's go on to what it does have. One thing that's very interesting is that the House version of the bill, of the resolution, I'm sorry, increases the debt limit by $4 trillion. And that will obviously be very, very controversial because some members of the Congress do not want to increase the debt limit, but it's there in the current draft. The Senate doesn't address this issue. So they either are going to add that later or they're looking to another legislative vehicle to increase the debt limit. Let's look at the timing of reconciliation. So it's interesting that the House is saying that the reconciliation bills should come from the authorizing committees to the House Budget Committee by March 27th. But the Senate is a much faster deadline, or at least 20 days faster, says that the bills are due March 7th. And we'll see why in a minute, because the House is trying to do much more in their reconciliation bill than the Senate. Now look at this chart. It's a bit small, so I'm going to kind of walk you through it. But this shows the summary of the instructions that have been given to the committees in both the House and the Senate. And the biggest one is the Committee on Ways and Means, the Tax Committee, has been directed to increase that they should do legislation that can increase the deficit by $4.5 trillion. And then there's other spending that's added that both the House and the Senate do, because the Senate is not going to take on the tax bill yet. You've heard the debate between the one beautiful bill that President Trump wants, which is the House version, and the Senate leaders who think it's better to go to do spending increases for the border and national defense first and take this more complicated tax bill and put it on the 26th budget resolution, which will come in a few days, which will be done later in the summer or in the fall. So then there's a series of increases there. But then we get to the offsets: energy and commerce, education and agriculture, and government oversight. And we're going to go through what those are in a few minutes. But these offsets, the thing to note, do not equal zero. It doesn't balance out. So the House reconciliation instructions as they exist now will increase the national debt over a 10-year period, $3.2 trillion. That's a lot of money. Now, Senator Graham, the chairman of the Senate Budget Committee, says that his bill will eventually be budget neutral. So currently, the way it's written in the instructions, he would have $472 billion worth of additions to the deficit in 10 years. But he says he's going to fix that. And so we will look for further adjustments to get rid of that and make it budget neutral. So now let's go through the specifics of instructions to each committee. Let's look at taxes. The House Ways and Means, according to these instructions, may increase the deficit by $4.5 trillion over 10 years. That's big, big money. And you can see, though, that the Senate, as we said, is pushing this off. But let's look at some of the cost of the tax cuts. The CBO estimated that in May of 2023 that extending the 2017 tax cuts will reduce revenue by $400 billion a year. So that's the biggest piece of tax cuts that's under consideration, is simply extending the already existing tax code that was put in force, enacted into law in 2017. But during the campaign, President Trump made several promises that are amount to tax cuts. He said that taxes should not be paid by Social Security benefits by any Americans. Now, the current law says that over a certain income threshold, which is about $40,000 a year, Social Security recipients have to start paying some of that into taxes. But the way the law is set up is that money goes into the Social Security Trust Fund. So that will accelerate, if this tax cut goes into effect, the depletion of the Social Security Trust Fund. And then it also means that it will increase the deficit by $45 billion a year. And then there was the famous tax on eliminating the tax on tips. And that's been estimated by the Tax Policy Center to cost about $6.5 billion a year in lost revenue. And then there's the promise to eliminate taxes on overtime, which will reduce revenue. The Tax Policy Center estimates between $3 and $14 billion a year. And I'd just like to show you another view of the tax cuts that President Trump promised from the Committee for a Responsible Budget. They estimated that the extending the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act of 1917 would be somewhere between $3.9 and $4.8 trillion over 10 years. So that's about the $400 billion we were talking about. But there's also state and local tax relief that he promised, which I didn't even include in the previous slide, but that's about $20 billion a year, and maybe much, much more if you look at the high estimate. And then they have a higher estimate on tax of tips, a higher estimate on tax on overtime pay, the cut on tax and Social Security. They also put higher than what other groups put. And there's other tax provisions. So the point is that these tax cuts are going to reduce federal revenue significantly, and that, of course, increases the deficit. And that will be a real challenge to see how that plays out. The other increase in spending that is specified in the budget resolutions, the draft budget resolutions, is for the Armed Forces Committee. The House wants them to increase spending by $100 billion, the Senate by $150 billion. And one big question about this is, will this be front-loaded? Because that's over 10 years. And so they could put more money up front and then not later on, as long as the 10-year total balances out. Then you might ask, what is this going to buy? Well, President Trump has talked about an Iron Dome missile defense system similar to Israel's. And creating that for a nation this large will obviously be very, very expensive. He's also talked about the need for a bigger Navy, primarily to counter China's naval growth in the Pacific. And there's also been serious concerns about the United States' ability to produce ammunition and our ammunition stocks. So the plan of the House and the Senate, Republicans at least, is to dramatically increase military spending. Then they also, obviously, if you've watched the news, they want to increase spending on Homeland Security. The House is $90 billion and $175 billion in the Senate. And this is border security stuff, probably fencing, more agents and more staff for CBP and stuff like that. There's also kind of overlapping, and I put the jurisdictions here because it's not completely clear the difference between what the two committees do, but the Judiciary Committee is slated to get a $90 billion increase from the House, and the Senate wants to give them $175 billion. Again, this is things for like immigration integrity and natural border security, drug interdiction, and things around the border. So that's, $9 or $10 billion a year up if you're in the House, up to $175 billion in the Senate. And again, it'll be important to watch how they allocate it over the 10 years. Will they spend a lot more up front, which would have a bigger impact on the deficit in the beginning of the 10-year period, or will they spread it out more evenly? Now let's get into the cuts. So the House, and the House is the only one that proposes this, has proposed that the House Committee on Energy and Commerce, which in the House also includes health programs, should reduce their budget authority by $800 billion over 10 years. Now let's look at some of the programs under their jurisdiction. You're talking about grants to Medicaid, $635 billion, payments to the Healthcare Trust Fund, and then the CHIPS Act. Now the president has promised not to touch Medicare. So we have to assume, and again, this can change, we don't really know what's going to happen, that the bulk of these cuts are going to come to Medicaid. And that amounts to about a 14% cut in Medicaid expenditures over per year. And that we can talk about what is the impact of that on the nation's healthcare system, because it is pulling approximately $88 billion a year out of the healthcare system. What impact will that have on things like rural hospitals? Because if the Medicaid doesn't spend the money, doesn't give the money to the hospital, that means they have less hospital, and that means fewer doctors, fewer nurses, fewer facilities. What will be the impact on healthcare? The next big place that they're looking for cuts in the House is education. Now, if we look at the Education Committee, and their goal is to get $330 billion, or about $33 billion a year, And now let's look at where they come from. And here's the major mandatory programs, because remember, mandatory programs are where authorizing committees can make cuts. Mandatory programs are not the programs that are passed by appropriations committee, and that's a whole separate thing. These payments are these cuts must come out of the mandatory programs that I'm listing here. And the biggest one is student loan subsidies. And that's about $40 billion a year. Now note that that's a subsidy to a loan program, and that the actual amount of loans is $145 billion a year. And so to get a $30 billion cut a year, you're looking at cutting 70% of the student loan subsidy, which means you would cut about $100 billion of loans a year from students. And that, of course, is going to impact universities, because they're going to lose $100 billion in revenue a year. Now, the House and the Senate may try to mitigate this with other programs, other ideas, and they may shift around and find other sources to cut. But it's really hard to find that $33 billion a year without going after the student loan subsidy program. So the next place they're looking at is the Committee on Agriculture. And here the cut is $230 billion over 10 years. And again, let's look at the mandatory programs that this can come from. And the biggest program are the food assistance programs. The Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, which spends about $123 billion a year, and that's the budget for it in 2025, and child nutrition programs. So if you're going to take $23 billion a year out of these programs, it amounts to about a 15% cut a year on these programs. And you got to ask, what are the impacts on real people's lives for these significant cuts? Now, the Republicans say what they're going to do is put work requirements in there. And the clear implication of that is that, people really don't need these programs, that if you put a little work requirement on them, that they won't apply for them. And that's how you're going to save money. So we'll see how that works out. Lastly is the House Committee on Oversight and Government Reform, which is instructed to reduce by $50 billion over 10 years. And basically the way this committee is going to reduce the federal spending is they're going to increase federal employees' contributions for pensions. That's the proposal on the table. Now, the CBO did a study of this and actually included this in a list of options for reducing the deficit they proposed. And you can see that basically what happens is that employees hired before 2013 currently contribute 0.8% of their income to their retirement program, to the Federal Pension Trust Fund. This proposal would essentially propose to raise that to 4.34%. And so that means essentially a pay cut for federal employees of about 3 to 4%, somewhere in that range. So that's what this proposal is all about. So that kind of gives my run through quick analysis of the budget resolutions. I know it's fast. There's a lot to learn, a lot to think about. So I hope you will continue to look at my videos. I'm going to keep posting them probably weekly and as new information comes out. So if you're interested, please click to subscribe to my YouTube channel, and I hope you will be able to learn some more about the federal budget. With that, I want to say thank you for your attention, and till next time.